I guess it was a little over a week ago. I had gone to Sam's on a Saturday, and part of the stuff that we need is over in the food area, so I've made my way over there. And if you've ever been to Sam's or Costco, you know, especially on a Saturday, one of the things that you're going to find is that they've got samples of all sorts out. And so Philip is with me, and we've been getting whatever we need, but as we're going down the various aisles, we're checking out the samples as well. Anyway, we round this corner, and just over there, I can see there's an end cap that has a sample there at the end of that aisle. And there's a sign there that suggests they're giving samples of Butterfingers. Well, you know, I got to go over there. And so I head over to where that is, but there's nobody working that station at that point. But the Butterfingers are already there, already cut into pieces, and they're just kind of sitting there on the chopping block. And so Philip says to me, "Do you think we can get one?" I said, "I guess so." I said, "Get me one too." As he heads towards there, I take the cart and I keep going up the aisle. At that point, I am probably, 10 feet away or so from Philip, where he is at. And as he is behind me, I can hear this going on. Philip apparently has gone to pick up a Butterfinger, and I hear a woman's voice that sounds like another 20 feet away going, "Uh-uh." And apparently this was the lady who was working that station. And I guess she had gone to the bathroom or to get some more. I have no idea, but she had left the station alone. And so Philip has gone to reach for some of these, and she catches him mid-act. And again, at this point, I'm 10, 15 feet away. I don't even turn around. But I can hear this going on. And she's saying stuff to him like, "Do you just go get stuff out of other people's buggies? You know you couldn't have that. They weren't in those white cups already, were they?" I just keep going on. I don't know who's. And Whitney, if you could help me, the light imbalance is killing me. I'm dark over here, I'm bright over here. So if you can, we've finally gotten most of this working. So anyway, we are. All this is going on behind the scenes behind me, and again, I just keep pushing my cart, thinking, I wonder whose bad kid that is, just going over there to get candy, but she just honestly just kind of keeps going on after Philip, and finally she lets him go. By this point, I'm at the end of the other aisle, and Philip comes to me, and he looks like he's just battle weary. This lady has just sucked the very life out of him, and so I look at him, and all I could say was, "Did you get my Butterfinger?" He did, and so I enjoyed it, and we got a good kick out of it. Anyway, but all of that experience was because of this. He assumed, and I assumed, it was already cut, it was already there. The assumption is, I can go ahead and take this. They're giving away, it's clear, these are free samples. The samples are already cut, I'm just picking up what is already there. The assumption was it was okay to do that. In truth, though, that was a false assumption. We continue today looking at a series in the life of Samson, and we are doing so in a series that I've called Missing the Boat. And what we're thinking about, and the lens through which we're looking at Samson's life is this. Samson was a guy that God had amazing, significant plans for. God wanted to use him in profoundly consequential and significant ways. Unfortunately, what could have been, what should have been, unfortunately, in too many cases, simply did not occur. Opportunities that God afforded him were simply, effectively squandered. Samson, in many cases, is the story of someone missing the boat of God's opportunity. And we're looking at it so that we can learn from those mistakes and hopefully not make those, as God wants to use me, as He wants to use you, as He is providing us opportunities, that we don't also squander them. Today, though, we're going to see that one of the reasons that Samson squandered some of the opportunities that were given to him is because he was operating with some assumptions that were false, particularly as it related to his interactions with other people. And that became all part of the process and part of the problem as to why it was that Samson squandered opportunities the Lord gave him. But what were those faulty assumptions? Because if it tripped him up, it might also trip me, may also trip you up. Look with me in your Bibles today to Judges chapter 15. Judges chapter 15. We're going to start in verse 1, but just so that we're on the same page, think with me in terms of context what has been going on. You've got a guy named Manoah. He and his wife, who is unnamed, they don't have any children. God sends an angel to say, I'm going to bless you, give to you effectively a miracle child, but the totality of his days are to be dedicated, consecrated to me. As such, he is going to be taking what was known as a Nazirite vow. So his hair was not to be cut, it wasn't to touch anything unclean, and have nothing to do with alcohol. So that even if you were to see him, not knowing anything about his spiritual connection, you would say, hey, this is a guy that God has his hands on. Now, even though God did these amazing things at the very outset, even prior to conception in Samson's life, both his parents and Samson made some colossally dumb decisions. One of those we looked at over the past couple of weeks, which is that Samson did not guard the most significant relationships, human relationships this side of heaven, that of the marital relationship. And so it was out of bounds for Samson to marry someone that did not share a connection with God, that was outside of the people of God, but Samson didn't care. And in the end, even his parents didn't serve as an impediment for him making that choice. And last week we looked at the passage where Samson is gone, the whole dowry has been negotiated, a wedding is getting ready to take place, and once the wedding actually occurs, there's this feast, this party that's going on that lasts for a week. And at the outset of that, Samson makes a bet. He says to some of the people in his new bride's town, listen, if I give you a riddle and you can tell me the answer by the end of the week, then I will give you 30 sets of clothes, which we talked about last week. That's a big deal now, but it was a really big deal then. This is a significant wager that he is making. But if they tell him, if they solve the riddle, then he'll owe them 30 garments. Well, you remember what had happened about how his wife, because of the urging of the townspeople, she finally got Samson to tell her the meaning of the riddle. She passes that on, and so Samson is out all of this significant sum. What he does is to go kill 30 Philistines, take all of their garments, and then settle the bet. That's how chapter 14 concludes. Samson is furious. He's furious about what has happened. He's furious about having lost this wager. He's just so profoundly disappointed with everything. And that leads us to verse 1 of chapter 15. We're told later on, during the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat as a gift and visited his wife. You say, well, why is he going to go visit his wife? Because if you go back, in fact, look up just to verse 19 of chapter 14. The last part of verse 19, it says, in a rage, Samson returned to his father's house. He's just gotten married, but what he does is to walk away. He goes back home. And verse 20, his wife was given to one of the men who had accompanied him. So a wedding feast has already occurred, but the groom has just walked away. He's abandoned this marriage, and so this marriage effectively ends, I guess by virtue of abandonment, effectively becomes annulled. By verse 1 of chapter 15, Samson goes back to see what had been his wife. He left angry, and he did what any guy today does. If those of you who are married, if you have acted out of bounds with your spouse, when you return, you come back with a goat, right? Because who needs flowers or chocolates? Bring a young goat. And so Samson returns with a young goat and tells her father, he says, I want to go to my wife in her room. And his father said, but his father would not let him enter. Verse 2, I was sure you hated her. Now, why would he say that? Well, because he walked away. I mean, I figured, and we all figured, you had checked out. We don't know how much time has transpired between the end of chapter 14 and the beginning of chapter 15, but apparently hours turn into days, days turn into weeks, weeks perhaps turn into months. Samson's gone. The assumption is he's checked out. That's what his father's saying. Well, we just assumed that you hated her. You wanted nothing to do with her. And so I gave her to one of the men who accompanied you. So one of the other wedding attendants, one of the other groomsmen, that's now her husband. But isn't her younger sister more beautiful than she is? Why not take her instead? So if you still want a wife, I've got another daughter. She's even more beautiful. Samson, verse 3, said to them, "This time I will be blameless when I harm the Philistines." So he just killed 30 in chapter 14, but he knows that was because of his own misgiving. But now he says, "I'm going to be blameless when I harm you people." Verse 4, he went out, caught 300 foxes, took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, put a torch between the pair of tails. So you've got 150 pairs of foxes. He lights their tails on fire and released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines. So you've got 150 pairs of animals that are literally on fire. And what are they going to do? They're going to run like their tail's on fire. And so they are burning down all the fields of grain and the standing grain as well as the vineyard and olive groves. So the entire harvest has been destroyed. Verse 6, the Philistines said, "Who did this?" And they were told it was Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because he took Samson's wife and gave her to his companion. So the Philistines are ticked. And what do? They went to her and her father and burned them to death. So what had been Samson's wife and her father now have been executed by being burned alive. When Samson hears about this in verse 7, we're told, "Because you did this, I swear that I won't rest until I've taken vengeance on you." And he tore them limb from limb, and then he went down and stayed in the cave at the rock of Edom. Now, we don't have time to completely finish all of what's going on in chapter 15, but let me summarize what occurs. At this point, Samson is very much in full rage against the Philistines. And as he's trying to stew and figure out what he's going to do, some of his own people, some men from Judah, come and say, "Listen, Samson, you have really stirred the pot with the Philistines. Don't you remember, we're still kind of under their thumb, and you've really made life for all of us especially difficult. And I don't know what you were thinking." And Samson says in verse 11, he says, "I've done to them what they did to me." Hey, they started this, and I've just responded kind for kind. And so what they wind up doing is they take Samson, they tie him up, and we're told using new ropes, conveying the idea of their strength. And they're going to turn Samson over to the Philistines with the hope that maybe they'll back off of us. Maybe they'll leave us alone. And we're told that Samson was turned over to the Philistines. He's bound. He's effectively handcuffed. But then, again, the Spirit of the Lord, according to verse 14, came powerfully on him, and the ropes that were on his arms and wrists became like burnt flax and fell off. Samson just busts these ropes. Verse 15, he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out with his hand, took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Samson is going crazy and using this jawbone of a donkey as a brutal means of execution, and is taking out Philistines left and right. You say, my goodness, what a story. I mean, this is just an amazing spectacle that's occurring in Samson's life. You say, well, okay, that's kind of interesting. That's an unusual story. Hadn't seen anything like that lately. What does this have to do with me? What I want you to realize is this, that Samson acts the way that he does, and he makes a whole series of choices in this passage that are part of a bigger process and a bigger picture of Samson squandering God-given opportunities. And he is acting and he is making choices that are based on some assumptions which unfortunately were false. What are they? The first one is this: I can undo choices that are made. Samson is acting the way he does in this passage because he falsely believes, hey, I can undo choices that are made. Notice how the passage begins. We don't know how much time, again, between the end of chapter 14 and the beginning of chapter 15. All we know is that Samson leaves chapter 14 furious. He goes back home. No honeymoon, no picking out new refrigerator, no opening wedding presents, none of this. I'm done with this. I'm done with her. I'm done with her people. I'm done with her town. He heads back home as if he has never been married at all before. Apparently, enough time has transpired so that they begin to believe, well, Samson's gone. He's not coming back. It has to be that more than a period of hours, more than a period of days, almost certainly more than a period of weeks have passed, because now what had been his wife, another dowry has almost certainly been negotiated, a wedding has been planned, a wedding has occurred, and a feast is also now in the rearview mirror. So all that time has passed when verse 1 begins, and Samuel decides, hey, I'm going to go see my wife. In fact, commentators speculate that the language at the end of verse 1 is kind of loaded, where he says, I want to go to my wife in her room. That he's going to show up effectively now to consummate this marital relationship. But he's been checked out for weeks, checked out for months, and now he's going to show up for that? Why on earth would he do that? Because Samson operates on this notion, I can do stuff, I can act out of bounds with other people, and that's okay because I can undo what has occurred. He's going to show up with this young goat, and now everything is going to be okay. The assumption is I can make choices where, among other things, I can act irrationally. I can act without discipline towards other people. I can act without prudence. I can act without godly insight, and then later on just say, oops, my bad. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. You ever known any people like that? In particular, have you known people that were followers of Christ who said, hey, I am a Christian, they're wearing the Jesus jersey, they say I'm a part of the team. And even though they say that, how they operate with other people, even other believers, seems to be on this premise. That they can explode, they can treat you poorly, they can do whatever. And then come back later and say, oops, I'm so sorry. I acted out of turn. I acted without thinking. I'm so sorry. Certainly, that's not part of my norm. I didn't mean for that to happen. But then it keeps happening. Have you ever known people like that? I have. You probably have as well. And I realize every one of us is subject to having and making a mistake where we need to try to go and remedy and try to fix that. But the problem is, for people like Samson and too many others since his time, this becomes the pattern. And it becomes a pattern when we think, I can treat other people, even as a follower of Christ, however I want to. And even if I act out of bounds, somehow I can go back later and say, oops, my bad, I'm so sorry, and we can act like this has never, ever happened. I can undo choices that are made. But how well does that work? Years ago when I was single, my friend Alan would come over to my house all the time because he was single as well, and we didn't have anything else to do. And Alan didn't know how to cook, and I was interested in learning how to figure out how to cook some stuff. And I remembered I decided one night I'm going to try to make fried chicken, and I'm going to deep fry it. I had a Fry Daddy or whatever it is, Fry Mama, Big Daddy, something, hot thing of grease. But I didn't want just okay fried chicken. I wanted like great fried chicken. And at the end of the day, great fried chicken to me is determined by having great crust on it. And so I knew about just dredging some chicken and some buttermilk and flour and that type of thing. But that's so basic. I want something like Bojangles. I want something with some flavor. And as I'm looking for stuff to be able to put in the flour, I start looking in my cabinets to see what spices I've got. Well, some pepper, that'll be good. How about some garlic powder? Well, that'll be good. Garlic's good on everything except cereal. So we'll put some garlic in there. That'll help. And I keep looking, and I come across this thing that says Chinese 5-powder spice. I'll be honest with you, I have no idea how I wound up with it. But I look at that and I thought, I will put some of that in there. So I put some of that in there. I dredge the chicken. I coat the chicken. I put it in the deep fryer. I cook it until it reaches temperature, and I get it out. It looks beautiful. It's got a great thick crust on it. But is it good? No. No, it is not good. Why? Because I don't like cinnamon in my chicken. And I'm like, why do I taste cinnamon? And I start thinking through what I've done. The only thing that I'm curious about and uncertain about is the Chinese 5-powder spice. I look on the back of it. One of the ingredients is cinnamon. In case you're wondering, cinnamon is not good in fried chicken. But you know what? Once you put that in your batter, it's in the batter. And once it's there, you know what? You're not going to get it out. You can't undo it. It's like giving a haircut. You can keep taking it off, but you can't put it back on. You understand that, but that's basic logic. Unfortunately, too many times we don't carry that basic logic over to our relationships with other people. Samson is case in point. Here's a guy that thinks, I can make these terribly, egregiously out-of-bounds decisions. And again, this is somebody that supposedly has a really close connection with God. He's a Nazirite. The totality of his days are consecrated to the Lord. Even his hair is not cut. Don't touch anything unclean. Have nothing to do with alcohol, but I can treat people however I want and then come back later and say, time out, oops, my bad, so sorry. We can act like this never happened. I'm going to show up with a goat and everything's going to be okay. And he discovered that everything wasn't going to be okay. His choices had set into action the choices of others. And once the horses left the barn, you can't really get him back in. Samson made some lousy decisions based on the faulty assumption, among other things, that he could undo choices that are made. There's another thing that you see in this passage, and that's this, that Samson thought, I can control who is affected by my decisions. I can control who is affected by my decision. All right, so Samson is ticked. He walked away from his wife, and now she's been given to someone else because they figured, well, she's just been abandoned. This wedding is, for all practical purposes, annulled. Verse 3, Samson says, I'm going to be blameless when I harm the Philistines. He is seething with rage. He is furious about what has happened. And he wants to get all of them back, not just his wife and her father, but collectively her people. He's going to get back at his former in-laws and his former wife kind of indirectly. And he's going to do so by making choices that really tighten the screws on all of the Philistines. And what he does with the foxes and the lit tails, that absolutely puts the squeeze on the Philistines. All of their wheat fields, again, this is at harvest time, all their wheat fields get burned. So the entire year's harvest is gone. All the standing grain, everything that they had already harvested, that gets burned up. Their vineyards, all of that gets torched. Everything is nothing but an ash heap. And they are furious. In fact, how they respond suggests just how devastating this loss was. And so what do? They get what had been Samson's wife and her father, and literally they burn them to death. Now there's lots of ways I don't want to die, but probably chief among them is being burned alive. But that's the horrible, brutal death, horrible execution that they face. Do you think, and here's the question, do you think Samson wanted that? I think very clearly the answer is no. Do you suppose even that he wanted his former wife and her father to die? I don't think so at all. Bear in mind, notice how this story begins. He goes back because he wants this woman to be his wife. At this point, he is showing back up with this gift with the hope that somehow the bridges can be mended and the road smoothed out. He wants to take her as his wife and kind of just forget about the misdeeds that he had committed and spend the rest of his life with her. He doesn't want her dead, certainly not executed by being burned alive. In fact, his response in verse 7 speaks to his dislike of what they had done. He says, because you've done this, I swear I won't rest until I've taken vengeance on you. The point is this: Samson did not for a moment want any of this stuff to happen to what had been his wife or her father. And he's furious about why all this has occurred. But here's the question: why did it occur? It occurred because of choices Samson made. If Samson hadn't gathered up 300 foxes, tied them in pairs, set their tails on fire, and let them burn down everything, that would not have happened. But why did Samson do what he did? Because he thought, and the assumption undergirding his choice was this: I can do and I can make choices that affect others. And the choices that I can make, I will determine by virtue of my choice who all is affected by it. Now, you have heard, and hopefully heard repeatedly because it's true, you are free to make choices, but you are not free to determine the consequences. You know that. Hopefully you understand that. But not only is that true, not only is it true that you can't determine consequences, you also cannot determine who is affected by the consequences. In this case, who was affected by the consequences? Honestly, at least in form, the same ones that are affected today. And that's those who are closest. I mean, the very people that Samson did not want this to result in their death, what had been his wife and her father, they're the ones that get burned alive. Why did that happen? And why is Samson so mad after the fact? Because this wasn't supposed to happen. This is not how the story was to unfold. This is not who all was to be affected. This is not how this was supposed to transpire. But why did Samson make the choice in the first place about the foxes? Well, because he thought, and his choices were based on the assumption, I can control who is affected by my choices. It was true for Samson. It is true for me and you, again, that while we are free to make choices, we are not free to determine their consequences, nor who all will be affected by them. And unfortunately, those most adversely affected by our bad, out-of-bounds choices are the ones who are closest. They're the ones who most harshly tend to be affected by our choices. Probably if you've lived long enough, especially if you have children or grandchildren, you can probably think of some out-of-bounds choices that you made. Who did they affect? Who was most adversely touched by the choices that you made? It tends to be those that are closest to us, those that we want to be least affected, those that we care for the most. But why do we keep making such boneheaded decisions? Because so many times those decisions are based on the false notion that I can control who is affected by my choices. But that there's a final false assumption you see at work in this passage, which is this: I can act without restraint if I do not act first. I can act without restraint if I do not act first. You see that repeatedly at work in this passage. In verse 3, Samson is so angry. He says, this time I'm going to do something, and this time I'm going to be blameless when I harm the Philistines. So what's he saying? He said, I'm getting ready to do something really bad, really bad. But why is he going to be able to do something bad? He's saying, because you acted first. When the Philistines responded by killing what had been his wife and her father, what does he say? In verse 7, he says, because you did this, I swear I will not rest until I've taken vengeance on you. What's he saying? I'm going to do something really, really bad. And why am I going to do something really, really bad? Because you did something bad first. By the time you get to verse 12, his own people, they're saying, listen, we're going to turn you over to the Philistines. And Samson's response at the end of verse 11 is this: I have done to them what they did to me. So in less than a chapter, in a span of 11 verses, 3 times Samson is saying effectively this: I can do whatever I want. I can act in terrible ways. I can act without restraint. I can act without discipline so long as I do not do it first. I can't tell you over the years how many times a scenario such as that, at least in form, has occurred in our home. Those of you who are parents, or whether your children are now grown or still in the home, I am sure that you can identify with a scenario like this. In fact, in our house, it happened at least once, if not a couple of times this week. We sit down, we have dinner together. And as the kids get done, generally they're allowed to leave the table. We do that because ultimately they all leave. And finally, it's just me and Caroline left to enjoy a few moments of peace and quiet. Unfortunately, the peace and quiet tends to be short-lived because it gets interrupted by what's going on in the den. We can't see what's going on in the den, but we can hear it. And as we are sitting there just trying to have an adult conversation, we hear some hollering going on in the den. You'll hear some crying, and then somebody comes in to report. And so there was a reporting that occurred with tears in the eyes, and the culprit is named. So he says, so-and-so hit me. And why are you crying? Because so-and-so did this. So you summon the implicated party. So now we've got both of them in there. And at this point, my goal is very simple. I need to figure out who to spank, right? And so I'm trying to conduct an inquisition to figure out who is the guilty party. And in the end, you know what? They're both guilty. They're both guilty. That's invariably our story. But as one has said something, the other one thinks, well, because he said that, I can do this. I can say this, or I can hit him, I can kick him, I can do whatever. Well, then that leads the other one to say, well, because he did this, I can take it up a notch, and then all of a sudden we've got this brawl going on. But consistently, that notion is, I can do what I want. I can act out of bounds because I did not act first. He did this to me, she did this to me first. And so now it's okay whatever I do. Why is Samson acting this way? Why is he making these choices? 3 times in just less than 1 chapter. It's because, he says, they did it first. They crossed the line, and so now I get to really cross the line. Well, then when they respond in kind, he wants to keep ratcheting up the ante. Why? Because his choices are made on assumptions. And unfortunately, the assumption was false. Because he thought, I can act, and it's okay for me to act however I want, so long as I'm not the one who acts first. So there's 3 false assumptions at work. I can undo choices that are made, I can control who is affected by my choices, and I can act without restraint if I don't act first. So you say, okay, Michael, those are all good thoughts. That's nice. But in the end, what does that have to do with me today? What does that have to do with me this week? What's the takeaway? In the end, why are you spending this time this morning to talk about these issues? The reason I say so is because of this. Belief precedes action always. What you believe to be true precedes action always. About some things? No, about everything, even the most basic things. When you came in this morning, wherever it is that you were sitting, you were seated in that particular spot because you believed this pew will support my weight. I'm able to sit down and I won't land on the floor because I believe this will hold me up. You came here this morning in the vehicle that you have because you saw it on the lot, and not only did you think that it was decent looking, but you believed, hey, this vehicle will service me well. I will be able to depend on this vehicle to get me from place to place. But it's also true you believed you could cross the line sexually because you believed it wouldn't happen again. You believed you could say that because you thought the other person and believed the other person would never discover it. You believed that you could just try it once and never get addicted. Why in the world are we talking about these false assumptions? Because what you believe to be true affects the choices that you make. And if the beliefs that you have are wrongly baselessly determined, well, then you're going to make some terrible, terrible choices. I don't for a moment want to pretend that any of us is exactly like Samson, where an angel showed up to our parents and said, this amazing thing is going to happen, and the totality of his days are going to be used in amazingly profound, significant ways. I'm not going to suggest that God has these enormous, seismic plans for every one of us. But I am here to say this. He does have plans for me. He does have plans for you, where He wants to use the totality of your days. He wants to use you to impact other people for time and for eternity. He wants to use you as part of the process of pointing others towards Jesus. He wants you to demonstrate and to be part of the process of demonstrating to others the difference that Christ can make in the life of a person and a family. But I'm telling you, all of those plans not only occur as plans, but they come with opportunities, doors that God wants to, and He seeks to open to lead you through so that He can use you. And those doors get shut and those opportunities get squandered when you and I think that even as people who are followers of Jesus, as we relate to other people, we can act without restraint. We think it's okay if I say this, if I didn't say it first. We think, oh, well, it's okay if I acted out of bounds because I can somehow undo this. I can make it better. And I can make choices where I can mitigate and minimize the effect. But every one of those is a false assumption that will lead you to squander your God-given opportunities. My hope is you decide, I don't want to do that. I don't want to miss the boat of the opportunities God is affording me. Will you bow your heads this morning? I'm not going to pretend that I think everyone who is here today has a personal relationship with Christ. I do believe it's likely that every person here knows some stuff about Jesus, knows some stuff about the Bible. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here. But first of all, I'd like to say and lead you to ask this question: do you know for certain that you've got a personal relationship with Him? Because if you don't, everything that we've talked about beyond that today doesn't really matter. That decision is the foundation of any and everything else. If you're here today and you would say, Michael, I don't know if I've got that, or I'm unsure about it, or I don't know, I've got some questions. In just a moment, we're going to have a time of decision where you can begin the process of getting those questions settled. Or you could say tonight, as you put your head on your pillow, I am going to sleep knowing that I've got a relationship with the one who made me. But for those of you who've already crossed that threshold, you say, you know, I am a follower of Jesus. I know that. I hope you realize that God really does want to use you. And He's got opportunities just this past week that He's been giving you. Opportunities that are planned this coming week that too many times we're just squandering them because of choices that we make and how we act and react with people. Listen, just because you're a follower of Jesus does not mean, though He gives forgiveness and will restore and cleanse, we can't undo the choices that we made. We can't mitigate who's affected by what we do. There's no way that we get to act however we want so long as we don't act first. In each of these ways, it's entirely possible that God has shown you ways where you crossed the foul line just this week, where you didn't do exactly the same thing that Samson did, but you did the same type of thing. Maybe it was by what you said to a coworker. Maybe it was how you acted with a friend at school. Maybe it was because of what you did with a neighbor. All I know is this, that the God who made you wants to use you and doesn't want you to squander opportunities by having bad, faulty assumptions as the foundation for your choices. So things that He's showing you that need to change, honest confession that you need to be clear with the Lord this morning, you've got an opportunity to do that. My question is, will you? Whatever it is that God is showing in you in your heart that you need to be honest with Him about, will you do that? Maybe you want to kneel at this altar. Maybe you want to just pray right where you are. I just believe that as He speaks, He wants us to respond, and my hope is that you will. God, for giving us the story of Samson, we're grateful because it shows us that what could be and what should be can absolutely be missed out on because of dumb things that we do. And the smartest among us still regularly, unfortunately, does some dumb things. But it's the height of foolishness not to see the mistakes that others have made and choose not to learn from them, to not be affected by them, to allow them to have no influence and impact on our lives. And so, Lord, as You're showing us some stuff that needs to be reset in our lives, some choices that need to change starting today in how we deal with those at work, at school, in our families, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, that we start acting in ways that are befitting those that bear Your name, so that our choices don't close doors, but keep them open and enable You to use us to the fullest extent. That's our prayer, and as we have a time to make decisions to get to that point, I pray that we'll follow Your lead. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to ask